Imagine being the absolute final wall standing between a rising, incredibly powerful global empire and your homeland. Well, let's jump right into this explainer because today we're heading back to the 18th century to look at a leader who is exactly that. We're talking about Tipu Sultan, known historically as the Tiger of Mysore. At a time when the British East India Company was slowly but surely swallowing up the Indian subcontinent, Tipu Sultan firmly stood his ground. And as we'll see, his story isn't just about swinging swords on a battlefield. It's this really profound mix of leadership, rapid modernization, and ultimately incredible sacrifice. To really understand the guy, you just have to look at his defining philosophy. It is better to live one day as a tiger than 1,000 years as a sheep. Now, that's not just some catchy bumper sticker slogan. That was the core belief driving his entire resistance. It completely cemented his legacy as a fierce, uncompromising opponent of colonial rule.
Section 1. Raised for war.
So picture a typical 18th century prince. A lot of them were, lounging around on silk cushions, basically trading their kingdom's autonomy for a life of personal luxury. But Tipu was on a drastically different path. His father, Hyder Ali, had a very distinct vision. So while Tipu was mastering languages like Persian and Arabic, he was also getting this hardcore hands-on education in horseback riding, sword fighting, and battlefield tactics. By the time he was 15 years old, he was already out there fighting in actual military campaigns alongside his dad. He was literally forged in the fires of military strategy.
Then, in 1782, the stakes absolutely skyrocketed. Tipu inherits the throne of this very powerful military state, but with it, he inherits a massive target on his back. You got the Mughal Empire weakening, European powers constantly fighting for influence, and the British East India Company making its big move. But Tipu saw right through them. He knew they weren't just harmless traders, they were aiming for total political control over India. And he decided right then and there he was going to resist them with absolutely everything he had.
Moving on to Section 2, Beyond the Battlefield. Now, Tipu realized pretty early on that you can't just fight a global empire with swords alone, right? You need economic dominance. So he became this radical modernizer. Instead of just coasting, he actively boosted agriculture with new irrigation methods. He championed local industries, especially silk production and handicrafts. And he was bold enough to forge these massive international trade networks, stretching all the way to France, Afghanistan, and the Ottoman Empire. He even rolled out a completely new coinage system. Under his watch, Mysore rapidly transformed into one of the most economically developed, thriving states in all of India. And that relentless spirit of innovation, it bled directly into his military strategy. This is absolutely wild. His military genius birthed the world's first iron-cased rockets. See, traditional rockets back then were just fragile bamboo, but the iron casing allowed for extremely high pressure, giving them a massive range. When the British Army faced these in battle, they were genuinely terrified by the destructive power. The rockets were so incredibly effective that the British literally packed them up, shipped them all the way back to Europe, and reverse-engineered them to upgrade their own military tech. Talk about a game changer.
Section 3. The Complex Administrator.
Now, we know history is rarely just black and white, and Tipu's internal governance is still heavily debated by historians today. On one hand, some historical perspectives describe him as a very strict, uncompromising Islamic ruler. But on the other hand, the historical record clearly shows a leader who actively funded Hindu temples and appointed officers from diverse communities to the absolute highest ranks of his administration. So while the exact nature of his domestic policies will probably always be debated, both sides pretty much agree on one thing. His ultimate overriding priority was always the protection of Mysore and keeping foreign powers out. Which brings us to Section 4, the Anglo-Mysore Wars. This was basically a lifelong, bloody chess match against an expanding empire. It kicked off with a massive bang in 1780 at the Battle of Palilur, where Tipu actually handed the British one of their most humiliating defeats in Indian history. As we mentioned, he officially takes the throne right after that in 1782, but if we jump ahead a decade to 1792, the tide tragically starts to turn, setting the stage for his final stand in 1799. Let's zoom in on what actually happened in those really devastating later years. So by the Third Anglo-Mysore War, the British realized they simply couldn't beat him one-on-one. They end up forging these massive alliances with the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad, totally overwhelming Tipu's forces. And the resulting Treaty of Seringapatam in 1792, it was specifically designed to break him. He lost roughly half of his territory, got slapped with an impossibly huge financial penalty, and, most excruciatingly, he was forced to hand over 2 of his young sons as temporary hostages to the British. It was just a devastating blow.
But did he yield? Absolutely not. He actually doubled down. He immediately started preparing for the next conflict, aggressively hunting for new allies, reaching out to the French, and pouring every resource he had into strengthening his remaining army. The British realized pretty quickly that as long as Tipu Sultan was breathing, he was going to be a massive roadblock to their expansion. And that leads us directly to the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War in 1799, where British forces launch a massive, full-scale assault straight at his capital, Seringapatam.
The defense of that capital was fiercely intense. Tipu Sultan didn't just cower behind the palace walls. He was out there fighting courageously right alongside his soldiers on the front lines, all the way to his final breath. On May 4th, 1799, he was killed in the chaos, and according to the famous historical accounts, when the smoke finally cleared, his body was discovered near the gates of his own fort. And remarkably, his sword was still firmly gripped in his hand. He quite literally fought the empire to the bitter end.
And finally, Section 5. A complex legacy.
When Tipu Sultan fell, the British completely celebrated. They thought, okay, we finally crushed our greatest obstacle in India. But in death, Tipu actually achieved a sort of immortality. His absolute refusal to bow down became this profound blueprint for resistance. He emerged as a towering symbol of courage, deeply inspiring entirely new generations of Indian freedom fighters, who would eventually take up the long, arduous struggle for independence.
So I want to leave you with this lingering question to think about. If true leadership means defending your land and your people with honor, how does Tipu Sultan's absolute refusal to surrender change how we view the cost of freedom? He was a warrior, an incredible strategist, and a brilliant reformer who stood face to face with a rapidly expanding global empire. He may have lost his life, but his relentless spirit is a pretty stark reminder that freedom almost always demands the ultimate price. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll